The last thing I expected to find on that ridge was proof that my grandfather had told the truth his whole life. I had gone up there to settle something in myself, something small and private, the kind of thing a 68-year-old man does when he has run out of other reasons to get out of bed in the morning. I was not looking for anything. That is what I need you to understand before I tell you the rest of it. I went up Cutter Ridge alone, with my old beagle Mabel and my grandfather's field journal in my pack, and by the second evening I was standing at the edge of my camp, unable to breathe, looking at something that should not have been possible, and feeling the long weight of grief and shame lift off me in a way I have never been able to put into words since. But to explain what I was standing in front of, I need to go back to the week before, and the months before that, and honestly a good deal further back than either of those. Loretta had been the one who made coffee for two. For 34 years, that was simply the shape of our mornings. She would be up before me, and by the time I pulled on my work pants and came through the kitchen, there were 2 cups on the counter, both poured. Not waiting to be poured. Already poured. That was Loretta. She did not hold things in reserve. She committed to them ahead of time. The cup she set out for me had a hairline crack in the handle from a fall it had taken about 10 years in, and she had refused to throw it out, because she said the crack was where the cup had earned its keep. I drank from that cup for a quarter century without ever saying so back to her. She had been sick for 3 years and gone for 4 months by the time the story I am telling you begins. I kept making 2 cups. I am not going to pretend I did not know I was doing it. I knew. I would pour the second one and carry it out to the porch rail and set it there, and Mabel would come and press her nose against my calf, and I would stand there until the coffee went cold. Then I would pour it off into the flower bed that Loretta had put in the year before she got sick, and I would go inside and start the day. That was what the mornings had become, a ritual I had inherited, slightly altered, without the person who had made it worth performing. Mabel was 11 years old that fall. She moved like she had mortar in her joints, slow and deliberate, but her nose still worked fine, and she still wanted to be wherever I was, which is more than I could say for most things in my life at that point. My son Denny had called in June, after Loretta's service, and again in July, and I had picked up both times and said I was fine, and meant it the way a man means it, when what he is actually saying is that he does not want to be asked any further. By August, Denny had stopped calling. I did not blame him for that. I had trained him to stop. That is the part I carried quietly into September, alongside the grief itself, alongside the second cup of cold coffee on the rail. I want to tell you something before I go further. I spent 31 years as a trail crew foreman for the Forest Service. I have mapped terrain in 4 states. I know what a bear print looks like in mud, what a wind throw sounds like before it happens, what the particular quality of silence in a hollow means when it is 11 degrees and the air is stacked. I am not a person who misidentifies things or embellishes them. I have spent my life, professionally and personally, committed to what I could actually measure. That history matters for what I am about to tell you. And if you find yourself skeptical, I want you to know that I spent a considerable amount of time being skeptical on your behalf before I arrived at what you are going to hear. I found Earl's journal in October, when I was finally clearing the spare bedroom shelf where Loretta had stored things she considered worth keeping. Earl was my grandfather on my father's side. He died in 1979 when I was 23, and I had inherited his field journal without ever reading much of it. It was a small thing, brown cloth cover, swollen from old moisture, the pages soft as felt in the middle and stiff at the outer edges. Loretta had shelved it between a hymnal and a seed catalogue, which was her way of filing things she cared about but could not categorize. I sat on the edge of the guest bed and opened it. Most of Earl's entries were what you would expect from a man who spent his life running a small cattle operation in the mountain country of western North Carolina. Fence repair, weather notes, head counts. A winter entry about a heifer who had gotten into the laurel thicket and come out thinner and meaner for it. But near the back, there were 2 pages in a different hand than the rest, written in a tighter, more careful script, as though Earl had known what he was setting down and wanted it legible for someone who was not him. The entry was dated July 14th, 1962. Earl would have been 51 years old. He had gone up to Cutter Ridge alone to check the upper fence line, a 6-mile walk from the road to the high pasture where he sometimes ran summer cattle. He described stopping at the creek crossing just below the tree line, noticing that the birds had gone quiet in a particular way, not the sudden drop you get when a hawk crosses, but a gradual withdrawal, like someone slowly turning down the sound on a radio. He described standing still for a long time. He described seeing something at the tree line that he measured, carefully, against the height of a hemlock he knew to be about 40 feet tall, and he described the way it moved, deliberate and unhurried, and the way it looked at him, and the way it did not come toward him but did not leave either. He wrote, "It seemed more interested in whether I was all right than in whether I was a threat." That was the phrase that stopped me. I had heard pieces of this story from my father when I was a boy. He had told it with the amused patience of a man relating something he found slightly pathetic about someone he otherwise admired. Earl got spooked on the ridge and thought he saw something. That was how my father carried it. That was how the family had always carried it. An old man's story. The kind of thing that happens to a man when he has been alone too long in the woods with too little sleep and too much quiet. I read those 2 pages 3 times, sitting on that guest bed with Mabel pressed against my shin. Then I set the journal on the nightstand, went to the kitchen and made myself 1 cup of coffee. Just 1. I stood at the window and looked at the ridgeline on the horizon, the one you can see from the house on clear days, and I understood that I was going to walk that route. Not because I believed Earl's account. Not then. I was going because I was 68 years old and my wife was 4 months dead and my son had stopped calling, and I needed to do something with my body that had a defined start and end. Something with a specific piece of ground I could either confirm or rule out. Something that felt like settling a thing rather than enduring one. I took 2 days off the following week. I packed a single night camp, which for me is a modest affair. A small tent, a sleeping bag rated to 20 degrees, a camp stove, food for 2 days, and my trail work kit, which includes a hand level, a compass, and a notebook. I put Earl's field journal in the top of the pack, not because I had a plan for it, but because it seemed wrong to leave it behind. Mabel watched me pack from the corner of the bedroom with the expression she always wore when a bag came out, half eager and half resigned, like she already knew the trip would involve more walking than she preferred. "You're coming," I told her. She thumped her tail once on the floor. I left the house early on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of October. I poured the coffee, 2 cups out of habit, carried 1 to the rail, and stood there for a moment in the cold dark. The 2nd cup steamed on the painted wood. I said something under my breath to Loretta, the way I had taken to doing. Not a prayer exactly, more like a short report on my intentions. Then I put Mabel in the truck and drove the 40 minutes to the Cutter Ridge trailhead. The trail crew I had worked with for years had maintained that route, and I felt the familiar weight of that as I signed the register at the board and started up. My handwriting on the page. My name, the same hand that had signed off on work orders for this very trail for the better part of 2 decades. I knew the grade, the drainage problems at the 3rd switchback, the section of rotten puncheon at mile 2 that my old crew had replaced 3 times in the span of 10 years because nobody upstream had addressed the source of the water problem. I knew this mountain the way you know something you have been responsible for. The first day was simply a long walk in good weather. The leaves had peaked 2 weeks earlier, and the oaks still held colour, a deep rust and copper that came in and out of the light as the ridge shifted. Mabel moved slowly but steadily, her nose working the shoulders of the trail, her ears swinging with each step. We reached the creek crossing Earl had described by early afternoon. I recognized the spot from his journal entry without any difficulty. The creek bent sharply right around a mass of exposed root and stone, and the hemlock he had written about was still there, or at least a hemlock of the right vintage and height, its roots gripping the bank on both sides of the crossing. I stopped and looked up at it. About 40 feet. Maybe a hair more. I set up camp a quarter-mile above the crossing, in a level clearing the crew had used for years as a staging area. I had slept there twice before on project work. The ground was soft with old needle fall, and the fire ring from previous use was still solid, though someone had scattered the ash. I rebuilt it, heated a meal I barely tasted, and sat outside the tent with Mabel pressed against my leg until the temperature dropped enough to make the sleeping bag a reasonable idea. I did not sleep well. That was not unusual. I had not slept well in 4 months. I lay in the tent listening to the night sounds, which were ordinary, and thinking about Earl's handwriting, which had surprised me. The temperature had dropped low enough that the inside of the rainfly was beaded with my own breath, and I could hear the small mineral sound of the creek moving over the granite below the camp. A clean rhythmic note that had been the same note when Earl heard it 62 years ago. He had been a deliberate man, Earl, careful and unpracticed at self-expression. The kind of man who took a long time to say things and then said them plainly. The journal entry had that quality. No inflation, no drama, just a man accounting carefully for what he had seen. I woke before first light, made coffee on the stove, drank it in the cold with Mabel curled at the tent opening, and told myself I was going to walk the upper fence line exactly as Earl had described, and that whatever I found or did not find was going to be fine either way. I want to pause here for a moment and say something directly. If you are watching this and you have had a story you've carried alone, something you cannot categorize, something you have not told most people because you know how it sounds, I'd be grateful if you stayed with me to the end of this. Leave a comment if you want. I read them. But mostly, just stay. Because the second day is where things stopped being ordinary. I reached the upper fence line before 9 in the morning. It was a Thursday, cool and still, the kind of October air that makes every sound carry further than it should. Mabel was working ahead of me on the trail, which was normal. What was not normal was that she stopped, about 30 yards ahead, at the edge of a small clearing where the fence line turned the corner of the ridge, and she did not move again. Not frozen in the stiff way a dog goes when she is afraid. Settled. Her nose up, reading something, her tail still, but not tucked. She looked like a dog who has found something interesting and is waiting for you to catch up and look at it with her. I walked up beside her. The clearing was empty. The fence line ran along the far edge in decent shape, an old post and wire setup my crew had reinforced years back, and the grass was short and matted with morning frost. Nothing unusual. The birds were quiet. I noticed it the way you notice a sound that has stopped, rather than one that has started. For 31 years of trail work I had moved through these woods with bird sound as a constant backdrop, so constant you stop hearing it the way you stop hearing your own heartbeat. What I was registering now was its absence, not the sudden silence of a hawk passing overhead. This was what Earl had described, a gradual withdrawal, like someone dialing the volume back slowly, one bird at a time, until there was nothing. I stood in that clearing for 5 minutes by my watch. Mabel stayed beside me. My first explanation was weather. A front moving through will sometimes do strange things to animal behavior. I checked the sky. Clear. No pressure change I could feel in my sinuses, and after 31 years, I am a reliable instrument for that. My second explanation was a bear in the timber to the north. A bear moving through a section of forest will produce a ripple of silence that spreads outward from its position, and I have seen it happen enough times to know the shape of it. But a bear makes noise. Not always obvious noise, but the forest registers it, and what I was standing in had no directionality to it. The silence was everywhere at once, which is not how a bear works. I did not have a third explanation that worked. I wrote that in my notebook, which is what I do when I cannot account for something. A man in my old line of work learns to document the things he cannot immediately explain, because sometimes the explanation arrives later, and you want to have the accurate record. Mabel and I walked the remaining section of the fence line. She moved normally for most of it, checking scent along the posts the way she always did, until we came down off the ridge and back through the lower timber toward camp. At the creek crossing, she stopped again, the same settled stillness, and looked at the far bank. I looked where she was looking. In the soft creek clay on the far bank there was a print. I crossed carefully and crouched over it. I am 68 years old, and crouching is no longer a casual act, but I got down and I looked at it carefully, and then I took out my notebook and measured it against the length of my boot, which I know to be 11.5 inches. The print was 18 inches long and roughly 9 inches across at the widest point, and the impressions of 5 toes were clear in the undisturbed clay. The depth of the impression suggested something considerably heavier than me, and I am not a small man. I weigh about 210 pounds in work clothes. I sat on my heels for a long time over that print. A bear paw does not look like that. A bear paw in clay is distinctive, with claw marks ahead of the pad, and the geometry is entirely different. I have measured bear sign in this drainage more times than I can count. This was not bear sign. I photographed it with the small camera I carry on trail work, took a measurement with my hand level to confirm the depth and angle, and wrote a full description in my notebook. Then I crossed the creek and walked back to camp. The field journal was gone from my pack. I knew exactly where I had put it. I am not a person who misplaces things in a pack. After 3 decades of working in the backcountry, I load a pack the same way every time, each item in a specific place, and I had put Earl's journal in the top zippered pocket where I keep non-essential but important items: a compass, the emergency mirror, the journal. I opened the pack on the tent floor and went through every compartment, twice, in order, the same methodical way I would audit a supply inventory. It was not there. Mabel watched me from the tent opening, her chin on the ground, tracking my movements. I sat back on the tent floor and tried to think clearly. No one else had been on the trail that day. I had not passed another hiker since the trailhead. I had not set the pack down anywhere except in camp and at the creek crossing. At the creek crossing, I had set it on a flat rock above the waterline while I crossed and crouched over the print. It had not been unattended long, perhaps 10 minutes total. My back had been to it for most of that time. I went back to the creek. The flat rock was bare. The journal was not anywhere in the vicinity. I walked both banks for 50 yards in each direction, looking. The clay on both sides of the crossing was soft, and I could read my own boot prints from the earlier crossing clearly. There were no other human boot prints. There were other prints, not just the one at the clay bar. On the upstream bank, in a stretch of silt between 2 exposed roots, there were 3 more impressions, partial but consistent, the same width and toe pattern, heading away from the crossing into the timber. I stood up and looked into the timber for a long time. The light was getting low, It was close to 4 in the afternoon, and the trees were blocking most of what remained. Mabel was beside me, and she was doing the same thing I was doing, looking into the tree line without moving, without alarm. I went back to camp and made a deliberate choice not to leave. I had enough light for 2 hours, maybe 3 if I pushed it, and I could have walked out then, been back at the truck by dark and home by 9. Part of me was listing all the reasons that was the rational thing to do. The other part of me was sitting with 31 years of field experience and the knowledge that the thing I had been trying to explain away for the past 6 hours was not, under any honest accounting, explainable. I set up for the night. I made a fire. I heated water and made a meal and sat outside the tent with Mabel across my feet, her solid weight a comfort in the way old dogs' weights are, low and warm and unconditional. And then I want to tell you what happened, and I want to ask you to extend me the same patience that I am trying to extend to myself in the telling. The fire had burned down to coals. It was past 7, probably closer to 7:30, and the forest was dark in all directions except for the faint lighter grey of the sky above the clearing. I was not asleep. I was in the state I get to on cold nights in the back country where I am resting without quite going under, aware of the sounds around me, the occasional pop of a cooling coal, the small settling sounds of the trees. Mabel lifted her head from my feet. She did not growl. She did not make any sound. She simply raised her head and looked toward the south edge of the clearing, and her tail made 2 slow sweeps across the ground. I turned and looked. There was something at the edge of the tree line. In the low dark with the coals behind me, I could make out a shape against the lighter grey of the undergrowth, and the shape was large in a way that my mind did not immediately accept. My mind went through its accounting quickly. A tree, a windthrow, a shadow thrown by the coals. It went through those possibilities in the space of a second and came back empty. The shape was not any of those things. It was upright. It was still. And it was looking at me. I did not stand up. I am not sure I could have. What I can tell you is that I was not afraid. That is the thing that surprises me most when I tell this part, because I have been afraid in the backcountry before. I have been charged by a bear, twice, real charges, not bluff, and I know exactly what fear in the face of a large animal feels like in the body. This was different. What I felt was closer to the feeling you get in the last moment, before a very hard thing you have been dreading turns out to be survivable. A kind of total stillness. A suspension of the ordinary traffic of my thoughts. Mabel's tail swept the ground again. Slow, steady. I do not know how long we sat that way. The coals went from orange to red, and the clearing got darker, and the shape at the tree line did not move, and I did not move. I want to be accurate about this. I could see enough to know it was large, considerably taller than a man when standing at full height, and wide through the chest and shoulders in a proportion that made the trees around it look differently scaled than they had looked all day. I could see that it was watching me. I could not see its face in any clear detail in that light, and I am not going to tell you I could, because I made a commitment to accuracy and I mean to keep it. What I can tell you is that at some point it moved. Not toward me. It turned, slow and deliberate, and moved toward the camp threshold, the near edge of the clearing, and it bent down, and when it straightened and turned back toward the tree line, its hands were empty. It walked back into the timber without any sound I would have expected from something that size. Not silence exactly, more like the specific soft sound of something that knows how to move through a place it knows well. Mabel watched it go. I sat there for a long time after it was gone, long enough for the coals to go fully dark. Long enough that the temperature had dropped another 5 degrees, and I could feel it in my hands. Then I got my headlamp, and I walked to the edge of the clearing. Earl's field journal was on the ground at the camp threshold, set carefully on a flat surface of exposed root. It was open. The pages it was open to were the last 2 pages of writing in the book, Earl's careful, tight script, the July 14th entry, 1962. A smooth river stone, rounded and pale grey, the kind that comes from a creek bed, was set across the top edge to hold the pages flat. I crouched over it. My headlamp lit Earl's handwriting from directly above, the small, careful script catching the light unevenly across the page where the paper had taken some moisture from the night air. I could read every word of the entry I had already memorized from reading it on the guest bed 3 weeks before. But I read it again, there in the dark at the edge of the forest, crouched over the pages my grandfather had written 62 years ago on this same mountain. The cold air bit at the back of my neck where the headlamp band lifted my collar, and my knees ached with the cold, and I did not stand up. It seemed more interested in whether I was all right than in whether I was a threat. I stayed crouched over those pages for a while. I am not going to tell you what I felt in any clean way, because I do not have the clean language for it. I can tell you that the grief I had been carrying for 4 months, the particular grief of a man who has lost the person who made the mornings worth starting, that grief shifted in some way I could feel in my chest and could not explain by any mechanism I know. I can tell you that something I had been carrying about Earl, a low-grade shame on his behalf, the family embarrassment of a man who had seen something no one believed, lifted off me entirely. I can tell you that I sat back on my heels after a while and looked up at the sky above the clearing, which was fully dark and crowded with stars, and I said out loud, to no one I could see, he told the truth. That was all I said. Mabel pressed her side against my calf. I did not sleep much. I sat by the dead fire ring with the journal on my knees, rereading the entry by headlamp until my eyes were tired. Then I went into the tent and lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the mountain, which had returned to normal sometime in the hours after the shape had withdrawn. Birds stirring before dawn. A small animal in the underbrush. The creek, audible from camp when the wind was right. In the morning I packed carefully, the way I always pack, everything in its place. I put the journal back in the top zippered pocket, the river stone in with it, because it seemed wrong to leave the stone behind. I pulled the tent stakes and folded the rainfly and rolled the sleeping bag. I cleaned the fire ring and scattered nothing. I took nothing from the site that was not mine. These are habits from 3 decades of trail work, and they were, that morning, also something else, a small, deliberate respect for a place I intended to leave exactly as I had found it. Mabel led the way down. She moved slower than she had on the way up, which was expected after 2 days, but she moved with the same steady purpose, checking the trail's shoulders, working the scents the night had left. I followed her down through the timber, past the upper fence line, past the creek crossing where the clay bar was now just clay with no extraordinary features, the prints softened by the overnight temperature change, and the morning light making them harder to read clearly. I stopped and looked at the spot for a moment. Then I walked the remaining 4 miles to the trailhead. I sat in the truck for a while before I started it. The cab was cold and smelled of damp wool from the pack, and the faint bitter smell of the field journal's old paper drying out near the windshield where I had set it on the dash. Mabel was in the passenger seat, which she took as her right on every truck ride, and I scratched her ears and looked at the trailhead board where my name was in the register, signed in Thursday morning, and I thought about what I was going to do with what had happened. I took out my phone. Denny's name was in the contacts the same place it always was. I had not called him since July. I sat there with the phone in my hand for a few minutes, looking at the trailhead, and then I called. It rang 4 times, and I was already constructing a reason to hang up when he picked up. Dad. Hey. I cleared my throat. It's me. I know, Dad. I can see the number, not unkind. Just his voice, the flat, careful voice he uses when he has been worried and will not say so directly. I was just calling to. I don't know. Check in. There was a pause. You okay? Yeah. I stopped. I went up to Cutter Ridge. Did a 2-day walk. Alone? Mabel came. Another pause. Longer. That's a long walk for Mabel. She did fine. I looked at Mabel, who was watching me with the patience of an animal who has heard a great many phone calls and found all of them roughly equivalent in interest. I found some things I needed to find. I'll tell you about it sometime. Okay. And Denny. I stopped again. He waited. I'm sorry it's been so quiet. My end of it. The pause this time was the kind that is doing something. It's okay, Dad. It's not, really. But I'm working on it. Okay, he said again, and this time the word had some warmth in it. We talked for another few minutes about nothing particular. The kind of conversation where the point is the talking rather than the content, and when I hung up, I sat in the truck for another minute and watched the morning move through the trees at the trailhead. Mabel put her chin on my knee. I drove home. I parked the truck and got Mabel down from the seat and went inside and set my pack by the door, the way I always do after a trip, to sort later when the shoulders have had a chance to rest. I went to the kitchen and made coffee, and I poured 2 cups, the way I always did. I carried one out to the rail. I stood there with my cup in both hands, the cold coming off the ridge in the early morning, and I looked at the second cup steaming on the painted wood, and I thought about Loretta, who had filled that cup for 34 years before I started filling it for her. I thought about Earl, who had walked up to that mountain in 1962 at 51 years old and seen something he spent the rest of his life carrying in polite silence, because the alternative was to be the man his family smiled at when his back was turned. I thought about what it must have cost him to write those 2 careful pages and then put the journal on a shelf and let the years stack up around it. I thought about the riverstone in my pack, smooth and pale grey, and the way it had been placed with what I could only call deliberateness, at exactly the right position to hold the pages flat against the morning wind that moves through that clearing at elevation. I am not going to tell you what I think it is. I want to be clear about that. I have made peace with not having a category that works. I spent 31 years applying categories to things in the forest, and I know the limits of the instrument. Some things are outside the range of what that instrument was designed to measure, and a man who has calibrated enough equipment in his life knows that the limitation is in the instrument, not necessarily in the thing. What I can tell you is what changed. I call Denny on Sundays now. We talk for 20 minutes or so, sometimes more. He came up for Thanksgiving, the first time in 3 years, and he brought his wife and their younger boy, who is 7 and named after me in the middle, Russell, which Loretta had always found quietly satisfying. We sat at the kitchen table and I made the meal Loretta used to make, the same dishes in the same order, and nobody said her name more than once, but the room felt like she was in it anyway, which is the closest I can come to describing what that evening was. Earl's field journal is on the table in the spare bedroom now, not on a shelf. I set the Riverstone on top of it, which is not a ritual exactly, just a choice about where things belong. When I go into that room, I sometimes open the journal to the last 2 entries and read them. Not every time. When it seems like the right thing. I have not been back to Cutter Ridge. I have thought about going, and I have decided each time to leave it where it is. There are things you do not revisit, not because they frightened you, but because they are complete. What happened on that ridge is complete. Going back would be asking for something I was not owed the first time and am certainly not owed again. The mornings are still the same. I get up before it is light, I make the coffee, I pour 2 cups. I carry one out to the rail. The cold of the rail comes up through my fingers, and the steam from both cups goes up in slow even threads into the dark blue air above the porch. And there is a moment most mornings when those 2 threads of steam look like the same thread. And then a small breath of wind separates them, and the morning begins. Mabel comes and presses her nose against my calf, slow and arthritic, and mine. And we stand there together in the cold, while the ridge to the north catches the first pale colour of the day. I set the 2nd cup on the rail, and I let it go cold the way it always does. Some mornings, when the light is right and the mist is in the hollow below the house, I look up at the far ridge, and I hold what I know, which is not much, and what I believe, which is a little more than I used to, and what I carry now on behalf of Earl Harman, who went up to that mountain in the summer of 1962, and told the truth about what he found there, and was not believed by anyone who loved him. He was right. Someone was paying attention.